Good afternoon and welcome back. I hope that you had a good weekend. So I know that for many of you, you had just completed your first week of college, either at EOU, the first week of college ever, or your first week here after taking some time away. So I'm asking people in classes to just kind of share the words that immediately come to mind when you think about your first week. You think about like adjusting to this year at EOU. What comes to mind when you think about your first week? Exhausting. Sure. What else? Quick? Yes. Yeah. Feels like once the year starts, it just does not stop, right? Couple people in my other class said overwhelming, right? I know especially during the first week of your classes and just like adjusting to college in general, like you were presented with a lot of information and that can sometimes be overwhelming. How are people feeling overall with the pace here? Like, are things feeling okay? Are things feeling a little too fast, a little too slow? It's generally okay. Yeah, seeing some nodding. I try to be as clear and straightforward as possible for this class so you know what to expect. But if there are things that I can do to kind of modify the pace and help you as you're, adjusting all of your courses and all of that, please let me know. Again, I think that especially after that first week of chaos, a lot of things tend to settle down, right? A lot of instructors go over a lot of the things. In my other class, when people describe their first week, the word was syllabus, right? I know that that's gone over in a lot of classes, but especially starting this week for a lot of classes, we start to get into the really fun stuff. So I hope that you're looking forward to getting into a lot of these things that we'll be going over this week. So to get us started, once again, I have a practice question for you. So last week, we went into uncertainty reduction theory, and we're talking about that a little bit. And again, as a reminder, this is not going to be turned in for a grade or any credit. It's just a chance for you to refresh on what we talked about last class and see how you're doing in following these things in the course. So according to uncertainty reduction theory, what are the two primary types of uncertainty that we try to reduce through communication? Either A, verbal and nonverbal, B, cognitive and behavioral, C, signifier and signified, or D, physical and mental. I'll give you a couple minutes to look through your notes and think about this question, and then we'll chat about this together. Anybody who would like some more time on this one? Okay, great. So two types of uncertainty we try to reduce through communication. How many people feel that this is A, verbal and nonverbal? B, cognitive and behavioral? C, signifier and signified? D, physical and mental? Yes, so it is B, cognitive and behavioral, right? So we talked about uncertainty reduction theory last class, right? Uncertainty reduction theory refers to how we use communication, whether it was getting to know a partner or group of three in the class, or having a longer conversation with a close family member. It's about the way that we reduce the anxiety and things that we don't know about the other person. So lightning round, we have cognitive uncertainty. Does anybody want to take a stab at defining what cognitive uncertainty is? Or provide an example of cognitive uncertainty.
Maybe like how the other person thinks.
Yeah. So here's one example of cognitive uncertainty. I'm not sure if this person, like my roommate, likes the same sports teams that I do. I'm not sure if we can be friends, right? That'd be an example of cognitive uncertainty. It's not knowing information about the other person. You might, for instance, if you're going on a date with somebody, try to figure out if you're aligned on like social or political topics that might be important to you, right? Cognitive uncertainty is about understanding information about the other person. What about behavioral uncertainty? What would that be?
What the other person is going to do.
Yeah. So behavioral uncertainty is about action. So the example that I gave last class is the idea that somebody starts yelling and screaming, right? And you've never seen them do that before. You might really recoil and be freaked out about that person. I didn't know that you were like that or you had that side of yourself, right? That's this idea of behavioral uncertainty, stranger danger. So again, we use communication to resolve and figure out the uncertainty that we experience in our lives. Catfishing is an example, right? Meeting somebody that we might have encountered online face-to-face. So we talked about that last class. We also talked about this idea of perception, how we pay attention to and understand information that's given to us and do so oftentimes through a filter. And then we also talked about that 6-part model to break down how we do communication with other people. Does anybody have any questions about anything that we had talked about last class or anything about the course more broadly at this point? Great. Again, if you have questions at any point, give me a holler. So I am working through your Canvas prompts that you turned in last week. Thank you for getting those in. What I've seen so far is really solid, and I'll be talking more next class about some of the nitty-gritty, and I'll be providing kind of a paragraph of feedback for each prompt to let you know what you did well and things to keep working on. Remember that your second Canvas prompt is available and is due this Friday. So again, those will continue to be due on Fridays and be posted before the start of the week. So know that that is available for you to work on and get going on. And I also entered the attendance for last week's classes as well, so last Wednesday and Friday. If the attendance that you have listed is not accurate, please let me know so that I can fix that. Again, I like to keep you updated about your grades and progress of the course. So for today, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk a bit about writing. In the anonymous form that you all completed on the first day, a lot of you mentioned, wanting to work a little bit about how to write a college essay, but a lot of you also mentioned not being the most familiar with how to cite in like APA, MLA, or Chicago. So I do want to spend a good chunk of time going over some skills for writing. We will be writing an essay in the class later on in the term in week 6. So I think it's useful skills to know. And there's a good chance that you have to write essays for your other courses too. Like essay writing and writing tips are things that a lot of times your instructors assume that you know or assume that you have the resources to do. But I think breaking that down a bit will help, right? We communicate through writing a lot of times, especially interpersonally, so it's relevant to that. And at the absolute worst, if this is a total review for you, then you'll learn a little bit about the things I like in terms of writing. So a lot of the things that I'll be talking about in terms of citing sources and that type of material are not things that you need to do for the Canvas prompts. It's more informal, but for the formal essay that you'll be doing in the 6th week of the class. So we'll be going over a little bit past the 6th week. I think it's week 7. So we'll be going over some resources and opportunities there. So what I want you to do is take a little bit of time in a partnership or group of 3. These could be the folks that you chatted with last week or some new people. And I'd like you to take some time in your partnership or group to talk about what, in your opinions, makes for a good college essay, right? What are the things that a good essay does, and the things that you would expect to see from a good essay? You don't need to turn this in, but I am going to ask a few of the groups to share so that we can start to pull together some ideas and get a sense of what makes sense for good writing. So take some time to find some people to work with and take a few minutes to chat about this.
Some of essays will go. In my experience, best essays were ones that did not bring anybody.
They're direct, very concise.
Yes, it's okay to,
Concise, focused. I want to call on that.
Okay, I guess it depends on what problem you're writing. Like, you're writing scientific purposes or report purposes, then yes, lean, concise, cut. You don't need to do example, conclusion, stage. Anyways, but I think following the format, the rest.
Flow.
Yeah, flow. Because like, ramble on in the paragraph, and all of a sudden you jump down and it's like 2 sentences stating something really different. Format, flow, it's
Just like just like put it all out. Obviously grammar.
yeah, grammar. And I mean, a little bit miss grammar is okay, but it's completely. Perfection purposes, perfect grammar.
Well, good essay would have a good intro and conclusion.
Yeah. Avoid personal opinions if you're stating facts.
Yeah.
Or
Do you like?
you don't put I think, but so and so states that avoid personal preference.
Avoid opinion.
Avoid opinion. I mean, it's okay to quote someone else's opinion.
Usually people are taking that one.
If it's something you do that scientific or well, if it's reported your statement, then interpolate what someone else is about.
Take another minute to wrap up your discussion here.
So and so said, FYI. It seems better than just don't put I. Therefore, you conclude. Yes. Spelling.
I'll wrap it in. I've been somewhere.
True.
It's having a good voice. One voice isn't like how it flows. It's kind of like how the paper is written. Like you're speaking authoritatively about something.
You can read it without dropping it.
Great. Let's go ahead and come together to talk about this.
Yeah.
So I'd like to hear from a few groups in sharing some of the things that you all felt made for good writing. So why don't we start here? There's a group of 3 over here that I think had some good ideas to share.
Do you want all of our ideas? or just-
Sure. Throw them at me.
An introduction, body paragraph.
Mhm.
A conclusion. Good sentence flow and sentence structure.
Mhm.
Citation.
Okay.
Is that good? I got one.
Sure.
Okay.
What else do you have?
Thesis,
Uh-huh.
punctuations.
Mhm.
Title page. Organization.
Awesome. So these are a lot of core things that we're looking for in a paper, right? A lot of them will have introduction, body points, conclusion, good structure, use of citations. A couple of these, such as a title page, there might be some variation depending on the class and depending on what your instructor is looking for. Some people don't want a title page, some people really strongly do. In this class, it's not required, but you're welcome to include one if you'd like, right? So these are some really good sort of general categories of things that good essays include. I'm also interested in pushing a bit about like what makes those things good, like what is good organization or what is kind of good use of thesis. So we'll continue to explore that in a little bit. About the group, there's a group in the back over here that has some ideas as well. Mhm. Sure. Uh-huh. Mhm. Yeah. Right. So this idea that an essay doesn't just have the parts, right, but that it is easy to read, it makes sense to read, like there's a sense that as you're reading something, there's momentum, you're marching forward. There's a good chance for a lot of the classes that you've taken that you've had to read things that are written by like dead authors who did not write very well. And oftentimes for a philosophy class or even for something like a chemistry class, you have a lot of readings that are difficult to follow along. And my word of advice is most of the time, right, it's not that you're dumb, it's that they read poorly or they wrote poorly and did not organize or structure an essay well. I think a lot of authors who were smart got away with writing really poorly. And if you're having trouble following along, I think oftentimes that's an author's responsibility to correct. Are there any other things that are not listed here that your group talked about and see as important to good writing? Yes. Peer editing, yeah. So peer editing is something in some classes you might be doing in the class, like you might be assigned a peer to work with. Peer editing is also something you can do, right, as a practice where you're sharing and exchanging things. You could even put together something like a writing group, right, where there's a dedicated space to work with or exchange things with other people. I think that's awesome, right? You're welcome to do that for this class. As long as what you're doing at the end is your own work, right, getting that outside perspective and peer feedback on something, I think really helps. So I really like a lot of these points here about how to structure and include these elements of good writing. So I do want to dive into a little bit more about how to do those things or what makes those things work in practice. So for instance, what it means to have good organization, what it means to have good citations and so forth. Before this class, how many people had ever used the Purdue OWL before or heard of that resource? Several of you. If you haven't, right, I think it's a really great opportunity for you to support your citations in your courses. So for this class, when you have your essay later on in the term, you can cite in either APA, MLA, or Chicago. The reason I do this is because I know that if you're a major in something, or you're still trying to figure things out, there's a good chance that there's a format you're being asked to use for your other classes. So for instance, APA is generally used a lot in communication studies, but it's also used in a lot of the social sciences. So a lot of things such as political science might use APA. MLA is oftentimes used in a lot of the arts and humanities. So in areas like English, MLA is pretty common. Chicago kind of has a mix. You tend to see Chicago a lot in history. So depending on the courses that you're taking, you're probably going to start to notice that there's a citation style that your professors want more and more. My advice to you is to pick for this class, since you can use any one of the three, the citation style you find yourself using the most in your other classes or using in your major or what you're interested in taking. And rather than trying to learn all the different citation styles, I think a really good starting point is to really get one down really well and to stick to it. I will tell you the most common thing that I notice are folks who like have a mishmash of citation styles where it's kind of MLA, it's kind of APA. And so I think knowing the difference between those styles is a really good way to ensure that your paper is polished in the way that it needs to be. So the Purdue OWL, for folks who haven't been familiar with this one before, is a really great resource in Writing Lab that essentially has some really detailed guidelines of all of the different citation formats, and I've linked it on Canvas. It's a great thing that you can use in addition to all of the resources available through EOU, through Writing Center, and through the library. So as you're working through this, you'll notice that they have an MLA, APA, and Chicago guide. I think all three of those are really useful. One other thing that I wanted to point you to is that it's embedded, but you can also do a web search for this separately. How many people have ever used a citation machine or citation maker? Yeah, so a lot of you. What those are designed to do is to essentially allow you to punch in information or search for something like a book or article, and it auto-fills a lot of information, including the author, date, and so on. My advice is that you're welcome to use those. They can be a really great resource, but I recommend them with two caveats. The first caveat is that sometimes they miss information. For example, they might not get the author name, they might not get the volume, they may not get the page number. So when you go and enter information, double check it and fill in things that might be missing. The other thing is that when you actually copy and paste it, there's a good chance that it'll copy paste with different formatting. So I'm going to show you the easy way to kind of paste without formatting to ensure that you get it submitted in the right format. So one thing that we can do on this citation format, right, is say, the title of our book for this class, Interpersonal Communication, a Mindful Approach to Relationships. Citation machine has it, right? So you can click Cite, continue. So it has a lot of the information that it autofills, including the author and other details. However, one thing that it's missing is the edition. So I'd add that this is the first edition. Right, creates the citation. This citation, right, is an MLA style, but the Purdue OWL has embedded for MLA as well as Chicago. So you can copy the citation, right? And then what I recommend is if you right click on something like Word, right, and you go to paste, there's this option that's keep text only, which means all the formatting and other material is not there, so there's not a weird highlight color. We want to italicize this, title of the book, and then you can use Control or Tab or something similar, depending on your computer, to indent the second line, and there you go, got a citation, right? Generally speaking, in a lot of your classes, you're going to be asked to do both the citation list at the bottom for each of those sources, but you're also probably going to be asked to include the in-text citations. Purdue OWL goes over a lot of information about how to cite for a lot of different sources and provides a lot of different examples, right? So you could include under MLA, the last name followed by the page number, right? Generally speaking, there's no comma between the two. Generally speaking, you don't post the year using MLA, right? And then the references at the bottom will follow the format. They also give you the resources to enter citations manually. So if you don't want to use a machine, you prefer to do it by hand, you can. Oh yeah, I have a question.
Yeah, so it's like a website. You want the link in our citation?
Yeah, so if you do a website or electronic source, typically the best practices it includes the URL at the end. So yeah, look something like that.
And like you want that link like embedded into the citation, so you just click on it and go straight through it, or
The link doesn't need to be embedded. So if it just shows up as a link and it's not like turning blue and actually taking you to the site, it's fine. Yeah. Because if I were to go to print it out, it wouldn't make a difference. But yeah, good question. Yeah.
What are your thoughts on using words in source citation, like where you enter the information directly into Word's reference list, and then you can directly put your links into it?
Yeah, that can be really useful, right? I know other features, there's like apps like Zotero and other things that like track your citations. So those can be really useful resources. So anything that can help you to track citations and use those and just punch them in, I think is something you're definitely welcome to use. My advice is just to double check and make sure that it's formatted in the way that it needs to be.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's MLA, right? It goes over a lot of different sources. Chicago, right? So Chicago is the style that includes what are either footnotes or endnotes, right? Footnotes typically involve like a little 1 or 2 that show up at the end of sentences. And then at the end of the page, right, it'll have the reference. That's a footnote. An endnote is when you have the numbers, the reference list isn't until the end. So it can be a little bit more of a process to use Chicago, but you can use it for this class, and you can have things listed out. A lot of things like Google Docs and Word allow you to do that numbering scheme. And then APA is the other one. APA is the one that I use the most. Again, it's pretty common in communication. APA, the way that the general format works for this one is a last name followed by a year and a page number if that is relevant to what it is that you're citing. So for instance, right, Jones, 1998, it might be citing the paragraphs. If it's doing paragraphs, it might be citing page numbers, or if it's just citing the source more generally, it would be the last name of the author, comma, followed by the year. Again, I know that some of you might be familiar with this resource already or familiar with the citation styles. Just wanted to go over those real quick to give you a sense of how that's available to help you out. I'm not looking for formal citations on the Canvas prompts. Those are not required, but I will be asking you to do those for the essay later in the class. And there's a good chance you have some other classes that are requiring you to cite sources for an essay as well. Any questions about that with the citation style, formatting guidelines, that type of work? I know that sometimes working through a citation format and like citing your sources can be a little challenging. For me and for a lot of people, right, we're happy to look it over in advance, let you know if you're on the right track. You can also reach out to the Writing Center for additional support there. I definitely discourage the idea of like citation procrastination, right? Generally working through the citations as you're working through a paper is a great way to go. Knowing that you've got it good to go, or if you're kind of hitting a roadblock as you're writing, it's a really easy busy work task to just make sure your citations are all in there, right? Oftentimes a late paper is much better than a paper that doesn't include those sources. So the things that you all shared about what makes for a good and well-formatted essay, I think there are some really good practices, and I want to expand on some of the ideas that you all laid out about what makes for good organization, body points, etc. Again, I think these are generally useful guidelines, but especially in this class, the things to know that I like and I look for. So I think the first big thing that I look for in an essay is a clear argument. Right? This class's essay involves recording a conversation with somebody else and then reflecting on that recorded conversation to talk about what you learned about your communication. So for instance, you might say, in my conversation with my grandfather, I learned about the importance of both verbal and nonverbal cues to convey a depth of meaning, right? So really highlighting the things that you learned or you gained through the process is one way of including a good argument for piece of sentence. One way of thinking about this is to take a step back and ask yourself, what is it that I want the person to learn or to take away after they've read my paper, right? What do I want to make sure that they have known? And really framing that and stating that as clearly as possible in your first paragraph is a really good approach, right? A thesis sentence can at times feel a little bit on the nose. But I think a lot of people, myself included, would rather have an on-the-nose thesis sentence than not have one that's stated at all. So having that statement that frames your overall project is essentially, like the anchor for your entire essay. One of the ideas that I think gets talked about a lot, but not explained super well, is this idea of voice, right? And the importance of voice in framing your work. So one way of thinking about voice is to think about how you use sources. Say you have a quotation from Wrench, right? And maybe you're talking about nonverbal communication. Approach number one would be to quote Wrench and say, Wrench says that nonverbal communication is this and this and this. Wrench is right in talking about nonverbal communication being X, Y, Z. Wrench's argument is X, Y, Z, right? It can feel circular and a little bit repetitive, but the bigger problem is that you are almost giving a book report about Wrench, right? You're not making it about you or about your voice. The way to think about your use of sources is that these sources are behind you, right? They are supportive of you and of the point that you're trying to make. So rather than repeating Wrench's argument, you could say, Wrench states the importance of nonverbal cues for communication. I understand this, or using this information, I argue that nonverbal communication was present in my interaction, right? Think about how the source is helping and supporting what you have to say. Don't make the source speak instead of you, right? So I think that's one of the biggest things to note about voice. One thing that I notice a lot are essays that start in their very first sentence in the paragraph with a quotation, right? If you're using a topic sentence or you're framing a paragraph, it should be you. It shouldn't be the source itself, right? The source is not the thing that is framing the topic. You are. Organized writing. So a lot of you brought up the idea of an introductory paragraph, setting the scene, framing the body points that go over the main ideas that you might explore in an essay, and a conclusion. So again, I come from a background in speech and debate, and one way of thinking about this, I think is really useful, whether it's in speech or whether it's in an essay, is tell me what you're going to tell me, tell me what you told me, right? In this essay, I will be exploring the history of the banana and the ways that it's used in contemporary culinary production, right? In your introduction, you provide a preview or signpost of your main points. This is what I'm going to cover. Because you might know in your head exactly what it is you want to talk about in your essay, but we're not in your head, right? We don't have the same mental map or way of figuring out how you're structuring your project. So it can sometimes feel excessive or on the nose, but that level of signposting really makes sure that your point is clear. Then tell me, right? Using your body points, you use an introductory paragraph or framing to go over the main ideas. At this point, you're integrating that supporting material, your quotations, your citations, all of that stuff that really helps to back up your major points, right? And then in the conclusion, you tell me what you told me. You reiterate and hit back on the points that you made earlier. In this essay, we explore the history of the banana and some of the ways that it's used to make food today. And that helps us to just remember what it is that we were trying to learn. Tell me what you're going to tell me what you told me, right? Generally a really good format for writing papers. Clean conventions. So I'll be talking about a tip that I find really useful for conventions. One thing that I will emphasize is that you will go over a paper over and over and over in your head. And the more you go over it, the more likely you are to miss certain errors because it just flies by you and you're not looking at it with a clean pair of eyes, right? So giving yourself a break or time away before you revise is a really good idea to help make sure that things are as clean as possible. And again, as mentioned, consistency in your citation style. Do an APA, great. Make sure that you're including both APA in text and in your works cited. And understand how things such as last name, year, etc., connect up to that. So if you were like me in college, right, you procrastinated on writing papers. It is a thing people do. We don't like it. We don't want to do it. We like to plan in advance, but procrastination and writing it, that happens. It's a wonder that I'm still around and that my heart is doing okay after all the energy drinks that I had in college, pulling all-nighters, writing papers, so I do understand. But even if you're procrastinating and writing at the last minute, the brainstorming and upfront work that you've done will help you so that all you have to do at the very end is write the thing. If you have put in the thought and the mental work into knowing what you want to write about, at the very least, the writing process is not going to have as many roadblocks. It is much harder to write a paper the night before if you also have to do the invention work of trying to figure out what to write about or trying to develop your topic, right? So my advice is to read the prompt for something as early as possible and to just give yourself that mental space here and there to start to think about what it is that you want to write. Again, if you come in knowing what you would like to write about, it will be a lot faster. You're less likely to encounter a roadblock at the very end. Reading that prompt carefully and starting backwards, I think, is a really good practice, right? For Canvas prompts, for example, you might start by reading those and then reading through the text, knowing what you're looking for, right? I think that that can be a good practice for a lot of your assignments, especially if you have difficulty working through a full reading, right? Looking at the assignment guidelines or rubrics, if your instructor has those available in advance, I think is really helpful, right? Start making sure that you know what's being asked for and refer back to that as you're writing. And then another thing that I think is useful is to note what stands out to you, depending on how open-ended what you're asked to write about is. So for instance, maybe you found uncertainty reduction theory to be really interesting and you want to use that in your essay in the class, right? You might star or highlight that and be like, oh yeah, I want to understand uncertainty reduction theory in a conversation with my roommate. So really start to look through in your notes the things that you might start to draw from, since that upfront work is something that you will be very happy that you did later. I'm a really big fan of outlining. I think that outlining is not super hard to do. And the huge benefit to outlining, especially outlining early on, is that you have that to fall back on and refer to. You're not starting from scratch when you're writing a paper. You're like expanding out of and building out of the outline, right? So when it comes to using the outline is not something you need to turn in for this class, but it is something that I can look at if you want me to provide feedback on an assignment. In an outline, you are essentially providing the skeleton and structure of your paper. One thing that I really like is the use of indentation and subordination for your main points, right? You have your body, you have your main point, your indenting, going out, going out, going out, as you get more into the nitty-gritty of those points, right? So an outline is really useful in that regard. We're giving you something to go off of, right? The outline is an opportunity for you to develop your thesis sentence and argument. And when you think about your body points, right, you might be thinking about 2 or 3 different ways that you'll be supporting that key thesis statement. So, for instance, nonverbal communication is a crucial way that we connect. We can see this in the conversation with my father, both in terms of his own background and life experiences and how I learned about those experiences through his nonverbal expression, right? Separating that out and again, helping to make sure that we understand what you're talking about. And then in a really informal way, right, you can start to integrate those quotations, passages, and just the stuff that you want to include in those parts, right? One thing that I think is really useful if you start at this early stage is that sometimes your thesis, sometimes your body points and your main ideas change over time. You discover that there's one thing you thought you had a whole lot to say about and you don't. There's another idea that's like one main point that's just ballooning and you have so many ideas that you separate it into 2, right? There's the space for it to be natural and to evolve over time. One thing that I also really recommend in general for your classes, right? If you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed, feeling like you've been given a lot of information, is that for your major assignments, it's a great idea to work backwards, right? Start from the due date and ask yourself, okay, a week before the due date, what do I need to do? 2 weeks before the due date, what do I need to do? And give yourself milestones that might include an outline. You might say by the end of this week, I'm going to figure out my idea. By the end of next week, I'm going to develop an outline. And by the following Wednesday, I'm going to send an outline to my professor, right? That's a good way to help you to keep track of what you're working on. So outlines are great. When it comes to writing, And also when it comes to reading, right? We typically have an hour where we're in a good place and we are understanding material. And then we oftentimes burn out, right? We lose interest, we lose focus. You just start to do the thing where you're reading, you kind of glaze over, you're writing, and you don't really feel very connected to your writing anymore, right? Give yourself those small chunks of time to write and work. Like maybe it's just an hour or two a day to focus on those things. I think that that can really help to prevent that type of burnout or disengagement you have over a longer period. Again, migrating things from the outline into your paper is a really big help. It really helps with organization. I also encourage you to do what I like to call the sandwich with sources, right? If you're integrating a source or evidence, provide an introduction or context for a source. Don't let the quotation just appear out of nowhere. And then after you've introduced the source, explain what that source is bringing to the table, right? So for instance, we can understand the importance of nonverbal communication through Wrench. Here's a quote by Wrench. As one can see, nonverbal communication is a tool we use in our lives, right? You have explained the quotation and brought it in a natural way. And then another thing, right, if you are writing a formal essay, you're at more than half a page or so double spaced, there's a good chance that you have conveyed so many ideas in that paragraph that you can probably split it into two. So just some general tips about the writing process. So revising, my partner ran a nonprofit and she had to write a lot of grants and do a lot of formal and technical writing, in which case it was very hard to have a grant taken seriously if it had spelling mistakes, right? So she was very meticulous in writing a grant properly and ensuring that its conventions were correct. And one of the ways that she did revising, and I found super useful as well, is that you complete a draft like 24 to 48 hours in advance, which I know might be ambitious, but it can be really useful. And give yourself like a day or even a few hours where you do not touch, you do not think, you do not engage with your paper, right? If you print out a hard copy, after that day has passed, go through it and like read through it with a fresh pair of eyes. Or if you're doing it digitally, maybe download it as a different format and read through it in a different format after that time. You will notice so many more issues and things to proofread and just errors once you've given yourself time away from writing. Again, if you're going over it over and over again and you're in it, you're less likely to notice those mistakes. So I definitely recommend that method of revising. And again, ideally between 3 to 5 days in advance. If you send me a rough draft or outline, I'm happy to look over those and turn those around. Plagiarism, right? Plagiarism has been talked about, I think, probably in a lot of your classes. Some classes might say you get a 0 if you plagiarize, but I don't know that plagiarism is necessarily talked about or understood as well as it should be, right? There's two genres or ways to think about plagiarism. One is a formal essay or writing assignment where you should be citing or including outside sources and you didn't do so properly, right? I think generally that's not nearly as bad, and there's a way to work through that and ensure that you're in good shape. But the other one, of course, would be stealing work from another student or quoting blocks of things from the internet and passing it off as your own, or using something from another class with this class without talking about that in advance. So plagiarism is representing the works of another or passing off those ideas as your own. So plagiarism, right, would be something like a formal writing assignment. You have quotations and direct material, but you haven't attributed that material or indicated the source. Paraphrasing other people without attributing those thoughts, right? So it doesn't have to be a quote. If you're introducing a thought or idea or concept that is not either general knowledge or your own experiences on a formal project, you should still include a citation. I think it's a big misnomer that a citation can only be used with a quote. It's a good idea to use it with paraphrasing. Double dipping, right? Using something from another class, including something that's like exact. If there's a project or something from another class and you want to have a synergy with that in this class, I'm happy to talk with you about that. But just check in advance. Not including a full works cited list, like just including URLs or not including anything at all. Make sure that your works cited is included, right? Obviously, stealing work, having somebody else write an essay are no-goes as well. I think having something that's late rather than plagiarized is definitely the better option of the two, right? So again, I think it's useful to go over those things. You don't need to include formal citations on your Canvas prompts. You will need it for this essay, and you will likely need to cite sources for other classes. So I think going over and understanding what that is, I think is a really useful thing. And again, we're here to help. If you turn in something in advance and you want to know if you cited it properly, we can talk about it. So a couple other tips, right? Past tense and passive verbs. It has been decided that he had gone to the store, right? Things that are very convoluted and unclear are good ideas to revise and make as direct as possible. I went to the store. For this class, it's okay to use first person, especially when I'm asking you to reflect on things, right? I and me is fine. I do generally avoid second person though, right? Rather than saying you should do something, like who is the you? Who is the audience? Oftentimes you don't know that, so it doesn't really make sense to use in your papers. I noticed that a lot of memes are like fragments, right? When you make it to class on a Monday. When you make it to class on a Monday, what? Right? It is a clause in a sentence. It is not a full sentence itself. So make sure that you're using those full sentences rather than fragments in these situations. And as I mentioned before, right, with quotations, think about it as a sandwich. Rather than a large block quotation, introduce the quote, right, in your own words. You include that quotation and then you include something that makes that quotation relevant. A quotation should never be the beginning or an end of a paragraph. It should always be somewhere in between. So I'm going to ask you to get a start on this for today and continue on this the beginning of class next time. What I want you to do is to return to your partnership or group of 3 and get a start on this handout with your group members. So start to jot down the names of the members of your group and start to work through this. Again, I'll ask you just to hang on to it and we'll pick up more about that tomorrow. But start to chat about this handout and how you might be answering some of these questions. And you only need one per partnership or group.
This, are we trying anything in today?
Not for today now. So I'll let you get a start on this today and we'll pick up more on it tomorrow.
Normally the use of the quotation with the name, date, case number.
That makes sense because I know it's not MLA, so that just be name change.
If you only want to mention it.
Well, we know it's not the Chicago one because that'll just be a
Number.
yeah, the number. So. This one does not.
I would say that it does.
Okay, but still, are we? Well, yes, we're conveying. So I guess the idea. You're right. The idea.
It's not our words, we didn't come up with it.
But I don't. But at the same time, I don't know if this is a direct citation or not. We should check the quote or what you know. Or whatever.
Well, no, we wouldn't quote this. This is us speaking about somebody else's work. Like, let's say, for example, this came from paper. No, at the end we would do something like this, and we would put the, you know, the name of the people, you know,
The page number or wherever we're getting the idea.
so you really only need to use a page number if you quote.
So I know we're about at time. So what I'm going to ask you to do is have a person in your group who just hangs on to this sheet of paper. I'll give you some time next class to continue to explore it, and we'll be talking about this together, just as a way to help with some of those writing. So to wrap up for today, we talked about some of the resources for writing, some tips and best practices for good writing and using sources well, and some of the ways to avoid things like plagiarism. Again, we'll pick back up on this. You do not need to work on this on your own as homework. We'll have some time to work on it next class and talk about it together. And we'll build on that and talk about interpersonal communication next class. Have a great rest of your Monday, and I will see you again on Wednesday.
Yeah.